Welcome to Interstates. I'm Alex Chambers. It's been an interesting few months. There's been a lot of talk about the rule of law, checks and balances, free speech on campuses, whether jobs will continue to exist, activism, resistance. These are all serious and important issues to be considering. You know what I haven't heard people talk about much? Oranges. I have heard astonishingly little consideration of what you might want to whisper to an orange before you peel it. Admittedly, I wasn't thinking about that either when the basis of this episode got started. I had heard about this performance at the Eiffel Building in downtown Bloomington. It was called How to Preserve an Orange, and it was this kind of ritual participatory performance, a little hard to describe. But I heard great things, and so I decided to invite the artist who did that performance to do it again. Clay Schofield is the artist, and this time we did it at Redbud Books in Bloomington. Redbud is a community space as well as a bookstore. They do all kinds of cool events. We recorded the performance and participated. It was interesting and fun, a little weird, and it made me think about experimentation, being in tune with our senses, and play. I got to thinking, why is play important? Especially, why is play important in these times when everything feels so heavy and serious? I got a little bit convinced by that connection during the performance. I got even more convinced, though, when Clay and I sat down in the studio a few weeks afterward. That's what I'm going to play for you in just a minute here. Clay Schofield is a visiting assistant professor in digital art at the Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design. They're on the board of directors at the School of Making Thinking, and they're a co-creator of the Deep Play Artist Residency. Clay has MFAs in poetry and in studio art, and those both came through in the performance. So, I want to share with you the conversation Clay and I had. As I said, we did record the performance of How to Survive an Orange, and we've woven in a few excerpts of that through the interview, as well as a couple exchanges I had after the performance with people who'd been in the audience. All right, my conversation with Clay Schofield about play, identity, risk, and oranges. That's after a quick break. Can you just describe How to Preserve an Orange as a performance or event?
Yes. Can I? In How to Preserve an Orange, I invite people into a sort of collective experience with me. I am facilitating or leading us through a process. In it, everyone is presented an orange in the beginning, and I give us instructions to reflect on and connect to the orange in a kind of meditation. What are your first associations with oranges? Continue to examine the orange, thinking about these first memories. What comes up for you? And then interwoven through the process of these interactions that we have with the oranges, I have a few poetic readings that have emerged from my practice over the years. And those readings reflect on transformations in attention, also using the orange as kind of an object of focus or grounding, as a kind of metaphor, or maybe not even, it is literally about oranges also. Everything I've ever written about oranges is a true story. An orange is always a poem, dribbling from my lover's mouth, squashed on the sidewalk, or pressed into the palm of a dear friend, and so on. I meditate before an orange nestled on its altar. I breathe deep orange fragrance spritz residue under fingernails. So it's an interactive performance and reading that we're guided through a process, hopefully, to connect to the orange, but really as a space that we can, that's all a conduit, so we can come together and sort of pay attention to something and have that moment and space together that is reflective or contemplative.
Yeah, that's how it felt.
Yeah.
So it worked.
Drawing the orange close to you, whisper your secrets to the orange's navel. You can also connect and communicate with the orange telepathically if you don't feel comfortable actually whispering.
Yeah, I think because there was a sense of humor about what we were doing when we were whispering to the orange, for example, it made it feel a little bit more possible to actually do that and to play with that and to say things to our oranges, which is not something I usually do.
Both times I felt like I didn't have good secrets for the orange. So I'd be curious to know what everyone else told their orange. But
I felt like, I kind of felt like no one else was whispering. I was the only one actually whispering. And I started to tell the orange that it was just the two of us. We were just in this together.
Oh, that's so nice. Do you have other questions?
So I wanted to ask about the consent moment too and where that came from. And I'm curious if you've had conversations with other people after the performance about that moment. Because I did. I asked a couple people about what their experience was like, and multiple people brought up the moment of asking the orange for consent. And it was kind of uncomfortable because by that point in the process, in the ritual or performance, I think people were into it. We were no longer like, what am I doing? Is this weird? We were like, okay, I guess I got to ask my orange for consent. And multiple people, including me, were like, I don't think I got consent.
And the other day, I was dropping her off at school, and she was washing her hands like she does every morning, and she stops and she turns around and she looks at me and says, "Mom, are we meat?"
It's a big question.
And I was like, "Yeah, we are meat." And she said, "Do we eat people?" And I was like, "No," but there's just so much hypocrisy in the answers, and there's no way to answer. I don't know, and so I kept thinking about that with the orange.
Yeah. And there was a real, I think, moment of multiple people, moment of kind of tension in trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, both if you've talked with other people about their experience of that and also where that moment came from for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that I have. And yeah, it's absolutely meant to be a point of tension. It's like, it's a durational performance. By that time, we have, as you picked, like we've done a lot to like connect and build a relationship in a short amount of time in the scheme of things. But like there's a lot of space within the performance and time that by the time that we confront that question, like, we're probably more connected to this orange than probably most of us have connected to an orange before. Mm-hmm. And so it is supposed to be a really difficult question to grapple with, to sit with it and consider, like, what are my relationships to objects in the world around me that I don't consider in my daily life? Because, I think if we did think about our relationships to objects, we'd have less like disposable material. Like we would fix things, we would take care of things in different ways. We would at least pause to consider kind of the materials that are around us in the world.
Okay, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about how cultivating an attitude of play can help us take risks and stay open to possibility, especially when the powers that be are trying to collapse that sense of possibility. Stay with us. How do you think about play? Mm-hmm. What it is for you? I think there's sometimes when we think about play, we can think of kids, doing imaginative play, or we can think of, I think, adults. That probably the two major forms of play that most adults, at least consciously, engage with are games like video games or sports, mm-hmm. or maybe like board games or something, mm-hmm. or like Wordle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I think are all legitimate forms of play, but I think you probably have a more expansive sense of play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm really interested in play, but I'm not even particularly interested in games or sports. Because when the kind of play that I'm interested in, and I am interested in imaginative play, there are actually like two specific types of play. There's deep play and dark play that I'm particularly interested in that really would open up or be more expansive than things like games. Or like, to me, play is like, we think about like, oh, I'm doing this activity that's enjoyable, but really play isn't necessarily fun, isn't necessarily enjoyable, can be really dangerous, can be risky. This kind of deep play is, we might be familiar with flow state. So in a flow state, you're so engaged in and immersed in the activity or whatever you're doing that you can sort of lose your sense of self. So that would be akin to deep play. And like that point where you're so immersed that you lose your sense of self, like that's the possibility of like where I can become or like transform. So there's this potential site there for unexpected transformation, right? And so things like meditation can be that, like creative process. And it's different for everyone. Like everyone can kind of find that space for themselves. And then dark play is a kind of play where maybe I know that I'm playing, but the people I'm playing with don't realize that they're involved in a circumstance of play. Which sounds like nefarious, but there are situations where it's almost like what we were talking about with perspective of like how I'm moving through the world. Like I might approach like being in an institution as a situation of dark play. And so the structures that I encounter or the people upholding the structures might not understand that I'm positioning myself as a player within that institution.
Yeah.
And so all of this so when you brought up games and sports, like we can think of those as finite games.
Right.
So games where the goal is to end the play. Like you're trying to win a game, you're trying to win a sport. So there's this other kind of play, and this comes from James Carse. He wrote a book called Finite and Infinite Games. In an infinite game, the goal of the play is to keep the play going. So in this, it's like, you can shift rules to keep the game going. You can shift boundaries. You can, you're always renegotiating your relationship to the game and other players.
Yeah. Is there like an example of that?
It's living. Yeah. So it really is like, there's not the kind of, I think, Carse says there's one infinite game, and it is also about like, how do we structure life around play? How do we see play as how we're, kind of engaging with life, and that we are constantly negotiating like our roles and scripts within that game and boundaries in order to keep playing. And there are other forms of like ways to think about infinite games beyond like a sort of orientation to life, but maybe like in the process of noticing oranges, like that's an ongoing play. There's no goal, there's no end point, there's not competition. The rules could shift as other people contribute. So I think there are ways that, we could think about moving through the world and applying the principles of infinite games to like different interactions, right? I think about conversations as play, and I try to teach students this too, of like, how do you ask a good question? Like, you want to ask a question or come up with a response that opens up more possibility of the direction of the conversation. Or like, I imagine this as like, something to resonate with us, like someone who interviews people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. So
yeah, you said, I was already thinking of that. Like, like when you said the goal is to keep it going, I was like, oh, right. Like a good conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And that is kind of like, I think what I'm always doing when I'm doing an interview is like, not just how do I keep it going in a sort of boring, make sure we keep talking sort of way, but I guess you put it really well, of continuing to open up different possibilities and follow a path or multiple paths in a way that it's building on itself. But it's also improvisational and collaborative. And we're both together trying to make a thing happen that is interesting and vital somehow.
Yeah, and these other pieces too of like, play requires uncertainty. And so if we're really engaged in a conversation, like I can't be in my head like planning my next response to you. I need to be present and paying attention to what you say and then respond and not know where I'm going. Like, I don't know what I'm saying next right now. I know that like, this piece about uncertainty came up and I want to elaborate on that. And so, but also this piece of attention and being present with, your conversation player that you're engaging in the game
right.
with. And that you have to be open to the unexpected and willing to go there. Like if we're thinking about the uncertainty of almost living like day to day, like in our contemporary context, it's like overwhelming uncertainty of like things are changing so rapidly. And so when I say play isn't necessarily fun and play isn't necessarily enjoyable, part of the piece of like how do we live to orient ourselves with play as a central value of guiding our life. It's like this uncertainty requires a sense of play, requires a sense of curiosity, requires a sense of being present to the moment and paying attention and playing within this context that we're in. Like it's not like this is a fun game, but play can lead us to a sense of possibility and paying attention that could help us move forward in like a situation that like, it's not shutting down. It's like improvising within the moment.
Yeah, as opposed to something like control or a form of control where an outcome, a predetermined outcome, is already imagined, and we're going to try to get to that outcome and disregard all the things that might allow us to change directions and see anything that prevents us from getting to that outcome as an obstacle to be overcome. Rather than as something to encounter and change our understanding of what the outcome could be, who we are, all that.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to the deep play, which you said could also be transformational, which I think is kind of connected to this. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like I'm thinking about how the kind of play that we engaged in with the Orange, which was for about 45 minutes on one evening, I don't think an experience like that is necessarily going to completely transform someone.
Yeah.
So how do you think about the transformational aspect of some kind of play?
Yeah. I mean, I think engaging in deep play is like a ritual process. Part of my art practice and my facilitation of like community and artist residencies and things like this performance are like experimentations with like, how do I create the conditions necessary for play? And so in this performance, part of it is, how do I facilitate or create the conditions to support play, even if it's for this 45-minute duration that ends and we depart. So I think with meditation, it's like I practice this in little parts every day. And so I think coming together and experimenting with it, it's not necessarily like I am leaving transformed, but you might then, notice something a little bit differently or have a different sense of like time for a moment. And, transformation doesn't have to be sort of this grand way that I feel like I'm a different person leaving. And I think really important transformations are maybe the smaller scale of, I had this unexpected experience, and how do I stay a little bit more open to unexpected experiences? How do I stay a little bit more open to considering like my attention and like breathing in a space? All of these little things can be significant.
Yeah. Totally. I think it opens a door to an experience that you could continue to practice.
Yeah. And
just a door to like what's possible that like I could keep whispering to my orange.
Yeah.
And it really is like, could be very satisfying. I was listening back to the recording of the How to Preserve an Orange a little earlier today. And I peeled an orange and ate it without hardly thinking about it while I was listening to this ritual about paying attention to oranges.
Yeah.
And, but I wouldn't have thought about the fact that I wasn't thinking about it if it weren't for this. And next time I eat an orange, I do actually really want to spend a little more time with it, because there's just real satisfaction in like being a part of the world with other objects and other people too, of course.
Yeah.
But to taking that time.
Yeah. Yeah. And, a word that you used was like possibility. It's just like, I don't underestimate the power of like, even for 5 minutes, glimpsing like a minute where you feel like something is possible. Like, so even if it's fleeting, even if it's sort of in this pause and sort of reality of around and coming together, that like any moment that we touch into a space of feeling like things might be possible or potential, then the more we cultivate that, the more we practice being in the kind of world that we want to be in.
Which feels especially important right now when I think so many people feel like the world is so far from what they want it to be. And that I think it feels to a lot of people like possibilities are closing down and shutting down, which is true. Not to deny the reality of that, but that if we completely allow that feeling to envelop us, then nothing else becomes possible.
Yeah.
And so part of what you're saying, I think, is that play as a practice can allow us to stay open to possibility, even if it's just on a really micro level, but that practice can then give us more of a sense of possibility in a broader sense too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because we're in a circumstance where we're in conditions where others want to make us feel like nothing is possible. Like everything that's happening is to collapse the sense of possibility. And as you said, like, yes, it's real that through that process, like, yes, there are possibilities that feel further. But within that too, it's really important, even in like the act of resistance of like maintaining some sense of possibility or potential, or, practicing with community and on whatever scale, because part of the effectiveness of everything, like shutting down possibility. It's like, it's calculated. It's like,
it's totally calculated.
There are reasons why, arts and education are targeted. And those are both places of imagining possibility.
I gave some opening remarks at the event, and I think that I always feel this tension in myself between feeling like it's important to have a directed response to oppression, where I can see the effects. And so if we think about something like resistance, that like marching in the street or going to the state legislature or, blocking, sitting in a tree that's going to be logged or something like that is going to like be a targeted way of stopping something, and begin it with the idea too of like then building something different, but allowing the space to build something different. So I feel a tension between that kind of more directed kind of resistance and the way we often talk about artistic practice as being something that also can be resistance. And I think this conversation is a really nice reminder for me of actually how that works. That allowing ourselves the ability to imagine otherwise is essential to then being able to resist oppression.
On the one hand, I mean, some of the early questions or prompts were like, when did you first see an orange or think about an orange? And I was having a really hard time with that question because I was like, I can't picture the first time I've seen an orange. I can only picture orange juice. And I was like, this feels wrong. But also I have very loving memories of orange juice because that's what my dad was always drinking. It was always a thing in our house. He would like drink straight out of the orange juice carton, and we'd be like, Dad, don't do that. But so I was thinking of the in access I was having, or like the kind of weird estrangement from the orange, that even though I was holding it, had seen many oranges in my life, couldn't remember that initial one. And then,
I mean, I think, I have been reading The Poetical Wager by Joan Retallack, and jumping through, it's just been really kind of hitting and inspiring me. And at some point she's talking about, she has this concept of like the poetics, so poetics and ethics. But in it, it's just this basic quote of being like, in times of fundamentalism, complex thought is resistance.
Right.
And to see education and arts attacked also shows that, like, it's that's not to say that, like, oh, arts don't have value and we're cutting funding to save money. It's that, that this is a threat, and that this is an essential tool for resistance. That this is essential for imagining other ways. That this is essential for empowerment and thinking of other ways to exist and be, and to gather people in a community and practice other ways of being. And that, I think, that's why, you want to make art small if you want to control a population.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, too, this is making me realize that even my thinking that to resist something has to look in a particular way is a form of thinking too simply. And my own maybe avoidance of complex thought or a lack of trust of complex thought. And so I really appreciate that reminder, too, that I don't want to oversimplify and say they, but they, the forces that want to gain control and like have all the control and all the power also want us to not think complexly.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I'm like saying they these, it's just avoiding kind of clear subjects, but
yeah, I guess that's happening. But I think we could point to specific days that we're experiencing at the moment. But I also think that there are reasons to not in this conversation, because those forces play out on a lot of levels in a lot of places and a lot of times.
Yeah. I mean, the book that I mentioned was published in 2003 as a collection of essays written over a whole career. So, I'm reading back, that's like, 20 years ago plus. So, yeah, it's not new. None of these things are new.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's a prompt that you had in, I think it's in the Non-Philosophy of Play. So Non-Philosophy of Play is a book-length manuscript that you wrote from 2021 to 2024, according to your website.
Which I'm now still writing.
That you were still working on, that you're still writing, which seems appropriate.
It always becomes something else, but yes.
Exactly, right. That seems very appropriate. Because part of the point is that none of these things are ever finished. Yeah. Though it can be nice to put something out into the world, too. And that's one reason to tie a knot on something. But that the thinking is never finished. I'm working on tying a knot. Yeah. Yeah. But the thinking itself is always like, well, we get to a certain point, but we got to put it out. And then we keep thinking. Mm-hmm. So I think it was in there. But you had this prompt that says, tie the document to a ceiling fan blade, turn on the fan, chase it until you either A, grasp it entirely, or B, collapse. And I'm circling back to some things we've already talked about. But first, I'm wondering if have you tried that?
I have, yeah.
How did it go?
Well, it's funny. I actually did it for a documentary that eventually will be finished whenever they tie a knot to it. But yeah, we were like, how do we, we were trying to capture some visuals from writing, and how do you visualize the writing process? So I did, we actually we had a printed out manuscript and rolled it up and tied it with twine to my ceiling fan and chased it around. But then in that, it's like, I have my friend who has a camera also kind of following me around. And for me, as I age, I've gotten like way more vertigo. Like I can't really like spin around without getting dizzy. So I did kind of get dizzy and collapse a bit. And I definitely haven't grasped the entire document entirely, even as I have written it, as evidenced by going back and revising it and grappling with it more. So
Right.
So
It feels like a
I chased
collapse.
it till I collapsed. Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to grasp it?
No.
Yeah.
But, I may be underestimating others. I think it's impossible for me to grasp it entirely.
Yeah. Why do you think you're drawn to risk and danger as a part of play?
Oh, good question. I just, I think that they are necessary components of play. And I think they are components that many conversations about play want to shy away from. So I think in that way, they're really highlighted to me as where are these the parts that we want to kind of avoid or gloss over?
Is there something in yourself, though?
To be drawn to risk and danger?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. I mean, even the nature of being sort of experimental across my artistic practice, I think speaks to wanting to push against conventions or take risks or be in that's not the easy that's not the easy route to go. It's
better.
Writing a poem that involves tying a manuscript to a ceiling blade fan versus that's not conventional poetic form,
lyric verse.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I have said many times play isn't about being fun or enjoyable, but I think for me the risk and danger often is the fun aspect. And I think it goes back to, bringing up the transformational quality of play or that potential. When we talk about what is possible, when we talk about potential, when we talk about transformation, and this came up in the reading, I think there's a quote in the reading in the Orange performance of transformations aren't cheap. It is not safe to look at oneself and become oneself and try to be authentic in our being, right? To change ourselves, to be willing to try to live authentically in some version of ourselves. That kind of transformation, that kind of internal work is not safe. It's not comfortable. So I think when I think about play as a process of how I might become myself in the world and engage meaningfully in life and be present and attuned, those are risky things. I don't know what I'm going to find. I don't know, what kind of ledge I'm jumping off. I don't know what I'm going to become on the other side of whatever process I'm going through. So I think to live with that kind of attention is dangerous and risky. And I think that's, as we dig into it, it's I'm interested in transformation. I'm interested in living aligned to my values. I'm interested in sort of how I become myself, as a to not tie a knot over anything. It's because so much underpinning my work as an artist or a writer is the becoming of myself, which is ongoing.
Yeah.
And when I work with community and when I facilitate groups and then I think about performances and why they become interactive is because, I'm doing this process for me and I want to also think about what is that process opening up together. To avoid seriousness, I think also is a way of protecting myself of being honest that I'm not an expert and I'm not presenting with you an answer. And I don't want at all to present the idea that I have anything figured out and I'm here as someone to deliver that information. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm how do we play this game together? Yeah, I think risk and danger are important to grapple with if we're really trying to live in a way that's honest with ourselves.
It can be terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I guess if we adopt a more playful attitude toward it, maybe slightly less so.
Or it's still just as terrifying and we're
It's true.
playing with it.
That's a good point.
Playing is, I'm terrified of like jumping off a diving board, right? Like my partner has twins and like went to the pool at Bryan Park, and they're like wanting to go. And I was like terrified of going down the water slide, but like, these kids who were like half my, like they were, like that's play. And it's like, yeah, I'm still like, I as someone who tends towards anxiety and like tends to, like I'm scared of, but it's like I think the playfulness is like, okay, like I just keep doing it, like, right. And challenge myself. I guess that also probably relates to my interest in risk and danger too, of just tending towards being anxious.
Right. I think as someone who's anxious, as I am too, there's a sort of constant sense of risk and danger. So it's about like actually kind of moving toward it rather than just letting yourself like sort of curl up into a little ball.
Yeah. Yeah. There are times in my life where I was like, is this something I don't want to do, or do I want to do it and I'm preventing myself from doing it? And I think, that meter allowed me to move towards risk and not let risk like inhibit me from doing something that I wanted to do.
Actually wanted to do.
Yeah.
Exactly. Totally. Yeah. So speaking of structures, I think you have something at 3.
I do.
We should wrap up.
Yeah.
This has been so great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Clay.
I'm so curious to see how it all fits together. Now, with what remains, you can leave a mark. Thank you.
That was Clay Schofield and their performance, How to Preserve an Orange. The audience voices you heard were, in order, Grace, Allison, and Faye. If you're interested in following along with the ritual, we'll post the full recording as an extra in the podcast feed for this week. And while I'm here, I'd like to give extra thanks to Maggie at Redbud Books and the whole organization for supporting this performance. You've been listening to Interstates from WFIU in Bloomington, Indiana. We'd love to hear what this episode made you think about. Send us an email or a voice memo to WFIUinterstates@gmail.com or get in touch on Facebook or Instagram. We've got your quick moment of slow radio coming up, but first, the credits. Thanks to associate producer Dom Hyab for putting this episode together. Thanks to Jillian Blackburn for keeping our social media alive and well. And for additional support, thanks to Eobon Binder, Luann Johnson, Sam Schemenauer, Peyton Whaley, and Kate Young. Our theme song is by Amy Olsner and Justin Vollmer. We have additional music from the artists at Universal Production Music. All right, time for some found sound. That was Marbles on a Wooden Marble Run. Thanks to Birdie Chambers for getting those marbles rolling. Until next week, I'm Alex Chambers. Thanks to you for listening.
Riding back at the top of the hunter's moon. See airplanes like stars slinging. Subliminal, we make the rounds and soon